Awesome. So, as he said, my name is Mike Levinick, and I am a technical support specialist with Jamf Software.
Brian Henkels, Senior Software Engineer with Jamf Software.
And I'm Adam Schreiner, also a Senior Software Engineer. So let's get started here. We'll get next slide. All right. So in our first session, we have a few topics we're going to walk through. So the first one is when we go into the roster data in your Apple School Manager, what that looks like and how we get that all into JSS and that process. And then dive a little bit into how the sync and keeping that up to date and what happens in the JSS when that occurs. And then diving a little bit into the student photos and the configuration required around them. So to start off with, for those of us who have been in and seen the Apple School Manager, this is where we start at, kind of our starting point, hopefully some sort of integration with student information system, or maybe we just enter the data manually. But in our case here, we have a few classes, and in those classes, we have teachers and students in all of them. And then once we integrate with the JSS, our end goal is to get this all set up. As you can see, we have our classes all listed here, and if we were to dive into them, we also have our teachers and students on them. And that was without all coming from the Apple School Manager service. So just to start off with, how do we start to get to the state to start with? So we go in our JSS today, we start enabling these new features. The way we go about that is the Apple School Manager is linked to your DEP token. And either if you had an existing one, worked with Apple, and that's now your Apple School Manager one, or you can just go into the Apple School Manager portal itself. You download the DEP token there. You create that as a DEP account in the JSS the normal ways as before. And then on the right, once we've created the Apple School Manager link, you choose that specific DEP token and set that into the Apple settings, Apple School settings. And what that enables is the JSS to now communicate to Apple using the roster API and pulling in all of that classes, students, teachers data from the Apple School Manager service. This dropdown will allow you to choose any DEP token. If you don't choose the Apple School Manager token, it won't work, you won't get any data, and it'll just show nothing. So once we have that set up, all the communication, the JSS has all those classes, those teachers, those students. We can now go back over to our classroom page, use the new import feature, which will appear next to the new button. And once we use that, we get to this new assistant for classroom imports. So on this page, we just are able to check all of our classes we want to add. And we can see that we have a few column names at the top. So now if we think back to the Apple School Manager page, you can see our columns, class ID, course name, and course ID. These correspond to the same exact fields you see on the Apple School Manager page and are what was pulled in from there. And you'll see the class name. The JSS is going to help populate for you based upon the course name and class ID put together. In some cases, we don't have this data, and you'll see some things such as generic UUIDs, something that's not quite as helpful. So if we can go back into the Apple School Manager and make sure to get the IDs filled in such that JSS is able to uniquely come up with these names and keep them readable. One other thing to call out here is when we are importing, you can see at the top, we do have a checkbox that will let you select all the classes at once. We do need to think about this in large scenarios, large schools, districts, something like that. When we are creating all these, it needs to pull in all the classes. So it needs to create classes, it needs to create users for teachers and students, and then link them all together. When we're doing this, you may want to think about doing them in subsets by school or smaller chunks at a time in order to keep the load on your JSS down and in a handleable state. So once we've imported gone through the import on the classroom, we are simply given our class in the JSS. And you can see, once we've done that, we have our class here, and we are looking at the student tab, and you can see it's also added our students. And if you look closely on the left, we also have one teacher assigned into our class. And again, this all came from Apple School Manager and was just done through the import. At this time, there are no devices yet, so only the devices assigned directly to students would be working, or to the teacher. One-to-one devices, no shared type iPads yet. So now if we talk about those students that got into our classroom, what is happening there? So again, on the left here, we have what you see set up from Apple School Manager. And on the right, we have one of our students who got created during the classroom import step. So we can see again, there's a few direct correlations between the fields that come from Apple School and end up in the JSS, mainly being our full name, seen at the top on Apple School Manager, and our managed Apple ID. During the import for a new user, we'll also create your general JSS user data, such as the username and the email, both coming from the managed Apple ID, where the email is the managed Apple ID, and the username is the prefix before in your email. This data is all editable as well. If you do have syncing, there are points where it will pull back in and overwrite things such as the managed Apple ID or the name if it changed, such that it keeps in sync with what's your actual student data, as we think the truth is what the Apple School Manager system has, as that is many times driven from your actual student information data. So when we're importing those users, in our scenario, we imported our class and all of our students were created as brand new users in our JSS. However, many times we may already have those users existing for other functionality. Maybe we had VPP assignments before, we had some other iPad set up, but we don't want to import and create brand new users and duplicate our users again into our JSS. So what we have is a section on the, if we go back to the Apple School settings, the education settings in the JSS, on the bottom here we have a matching criteria section. So what this does for us is we can choose two criteria, one from the JSS, one from Apple School Manager. In our case, we said existing users with this email matched Apple School Managers with that managed Apple ID. It would then sync the roster data into that roster section on our user and use that existing general JSS user information. Right now, we use the generic equals, so only if they were the exact same. We are also able to choose starts, ends, and contains to create more complex matching requirements. It's important to remember that these are harder for the JSS to calculate and will take more time and load. And again, we'll want to think about trying to limit the amount of users being created during that time to make sure the process is timely and gets done. So again, back to our Apple School settings. We can see in the middle here, we have the sync time set up. So when we initially uploaded initially created our settings and chose the linked DEP token so we could talk to the Apple School Manager, we were able to pull the data in and we got it at that time. But eventually it's going to change our students are going to transfer classes, we'll have new students, we'll have teachers changing, and the JSS needs to be informed about those changes. So in here, we can set up a time of day for the JSS to go out and ask Apple what the most current up-to-date school settings are for you. And we can choose a few different times. We can choose daily, weekly, and monthly. We can also set it to never, which will rather than, we do not have to disable Apple School entirely, but we can turn off the sync, which will freeze it in that state and not go out and get updates beyond then. When we're in here, if we were to step back into the education settings where we put the token, we can also click the force button, and that will go out at that exact time and request the data then from Apple rather than waiting till your scheduled time. This most likely won't be useful beyond manual changes to the system, as we're counting on the updates to Apple School Manager to happen daily and to get them, and then the JSS will be able to retrieve them nightly and get everything up to date and ready for your students, teachers the next morning. Then beyond that, once the sync happens, we need to be concerned with how actually all those iPads get updated. And rather than dive into that now, that is one of the main topics of our next section, if you would like to stay and listen to that. So to look back at our matching criteria again, if you remember our classroom import before, you can see we have our assistant here. We were on the first step, choose classes, and we've gone through the second step to look at to see our matches. And now you can see at the end, before we actually finalize and import any creation of classes or users into our JSS, we are given a summary of everything that's going to be created. And here we can see we can choose what classes are being created, what users, and what ones are being attached to existing or just are already in our JSS. So once we have all of our data into our JSS, Mike's going to cover a few things we can do with that.
Awesome, thank you. So at this point, basically, we have the import done. All of the data is into the JSS. And once the data is in the JSS, we're able to pull it, modify it, just like we can modify any other data. Like you said, with the exception of if a sync happens, it's going to overwrite some of those manual changes. But one of the things that we may want to do is to, for example, create a static user group out of the students in a class. Due to the location of these classes in JAMF, with them lying under mobile devices, there are things that we may want to scope to users, and we're not able to use the classes for that. So we can create a new group that contains all of the students from a class using the API. It's going to allow some greater scoping capabilities, and we're able to do this in bulk. That just got very bright. So using the classes endpoint here, we can get information about our classes based on the class ID in the JSS. And then we are able to post out to a user group. If we post to user group ID 0, that will create a new static user group with the information that we get. So there are 4 steps to this process. We are going to gather the login information and the range of the classes that we are going to convert. We are going to actually physically get the data from the classes that we want to convert. We're going to parse out the student IDs and the class name, and then we're going to concatenate all of that information and then post it out to the JSS. I'm going to show you guys more of a proof of concept script here. We'll kind of walk through it a little bit. I'll show you a demo. This script is going to be available in the resources section of this presentation. If you'd like to take a look at it, modify it. It's very simple, a very proof of concept. There's not a lot of error catching or anything like that, but it does do the job. So, step one, we're going to gather the login information and the range. As you can see, this is JSS user mike.levenik. We're going to do a secret read for the password, and our JSS URL is notarealJSS.jfcloud.com. It's going to then ask for the starting class ID and the ending class ID, and then increment the ending class ID just because that was needed for the math to work out. After that, we're going to set up our loop, and it's going to give a little bit of information about what it's doing. It's converting, and then the ID of the class that it's converting, and we're going to just kind of set up the XML that's going to be created here with the credentials and the URL all put in place. After that, we are going to pull down the list of the student IDs using XPath out of that XML that we just pulled. We are going to pull out the class name, once again using XPath, and then we're just going to clean up that kind of stuff and get the variables ready for concatenation. After we have the variables cleaned up, we just have a beginning which contains our XML prologue as well as the other things that need to be in there. This is not a smart user group, things like that. And then the ending of the XML, the echo is just for debug purposes. And then we're going to concatenate the beginning, the actual student ID list that we got before, and then the ending, and we're going to just save that in temp for the time being. It's easier than putting out the actual data, I feel, because you can always just check on the XML if you need to. Finally, we are going to actually post all of that to user group ID 0. We're targeting the file that we saved, and that is the end. So, is this the actual video? I think it is. Yeah. So if we want to actually see this in action, we can go to classes. We see we have 3 classes, English, Math, and Psych. But if we go to our static user groups, as of right now, there are none. And so we can pull up the script. And once we run the script, it's going to prompt us for the password for mike.levenik. And after we authenticate, it asks for the starting and ending class IDs. And then it's just going to run through. It tells us which classes it's converting, and it happens very quickly. And once that's all done, we refresh, and we can see that we now have 3 static user groups which contain the students from those classes.
And I'm going to talk about the student photos feature. This is it's really an optional feature, but it really expands the kind of the usability and the experience for using shared iPad. So just here's an example of the iPad login screen, as well as the Classroom app for a class that has student photos populated. So instead of seeing just students' initials, you can actually see their face. They can see their face. It's nice. All right. And then there's just the settings page. The settings for setting up student photos live on the Apple Education Support settings page, which is the same place you go to enable the feature in the first place. There's a couple important points to hit here. Is the first one I'm going to talk about is security. If anyone's set this up, you know there is a bit of work with certificates to get this to work, and also linking to users in the JSS. There's a couple methods that you can use to do that. It's meant to be flexible, but also simple. And then where the data goes, we'll actually talk a little bit more in the second session. But basically, this is one of the things that's included in the education profile that we're going to talk about. And then a little bit of talk about the distribution point. and what that actually is and what the requirements for that are. So here's just zoomed in a bit on the settings page. The first thing is there's a checkbox to enable user images in the first place. As I said, it is optional. The URL you need to fill out for the distribution points is, it's going to be the full URL to your images with replacement variables that you can insert to customize that URL. So you can sort of see just the end on the slide here. I've got $extension attribute. So in this case, I set it up to map an extension attribute on each user to figure out what that URL needs to be. So that ends up being, behind the scenes, it's really just a text find replace. So it looks at each user that we're deploying to and figures out which field you're interested in, or fields. You can have more than one. And then it literally just replaces that text and builds a URL that is custom for that user. So you could have photos named by student ID, or by username, or by email address, or by extension, your own extension attribute that you come up with. And then when we go to deploy that profile, we build that URL for that user, replace that in. One thing that's easy to miss the first time is you do have to have a file extension. So assuming you have a bunch of PNG images, you're going to want to make sure you have .png at the end of that URL that you fill in. Those replacement variables should be familiar if you've used them in profiles, configuration profiles. It's the same idea. And there is documents with all the options. I think we've got one linked at the end of on a resources slide here. So the next bit, just going down here, is there's a certificate download. So I mentioned security. The shared iPad and the classroom app, and actually also the user in the JSS, if you're looking at a specific user, all use mutual authentication to ensure that these images aren't just available to the world. So if you've got your distribution point filled with all the images of your students, those should only be accessible to anyone who has a certificate that we've issued. So the certificate download on the page is so that you can provide that certificate to your web server, which could be Apache, Nginx, IIS, and that just enable client auth with that certificate as basically as the verifier for client auth. And that's going to depend a little bit on which server you use, but they should have that documented. They all support client authentication. So below that is a upload additional certificate. And this is specifically for establishing trust between the JSS and that distribution point that has your photos on it. So if, depending on what you've got set up, if you've got a publicly trusted cert issued by a trusted third party, you likely don't need to do this. But if you've got something if you have an internal CA, or if you've got maybe a CA that's not trusted by Java, which we ran across in testing, you may need to upload an additional certificate here in order to get the images to show up on the user's page. So there's also the possibility that the iPad doesn't trust that server. In that case, you can use the existing configuration profile workflow to deploy that certificate to establish that trust. And like most things, it's very important that you test this ahead of time, because there's always, with this many settings, there's a couple things that can go wrong. Establishing the extra trust, making sure you've got the file extension on the URL are common ones. here is the most recent release of the Caster Suite documentation, soon to be Jamf Pro. And this describes all those replacement variables you can use, how to set up Apple Education support in general. And I believe we'll get this slide out in some form on Jamf Nation, so you can click that instead of having to take a picture of it. But you can also just search through documentation on Jamf Nation for that Apple Education support settings. As we mentioned, we have a related session, part 2, right back here at 4 o'clock. And thank you.
Thanks, guys. So there are more questions here than I've seen for a lot of sessions. So I'm just gonna dive right in and not tell that many dad jokes. So any particular debug logs to look for in JSS server log for troubleshooting Apple School Manager connectivity? Anyone want to field this one? And by the way, we have a couple of individuals from support that might choose to hop up here with us, but I'll make that optional. Only one of them is bearded enough to be on the stage. But
I'm trying. Do you have any? Do you know, Mike, any where you would start?
As far as connectivity goes, I mean,
yeah, like if you can't connect back to Apple School Man.
I can't remember if we have. I can't answer that off the top of my head.
Information forthcoming.
I've never seen it not update. Since we're recording. Yeah. I've never seen it not update, but if for any reason on 996, if you hit the force sync button, I've never seen it come back with an error, but I would assume that if you click force sync and it doesn't have that communication, something will pop up there for you.
Thank you, support Matt.
I would just say also, I would imagine if you don't have issues with like APNS and things like that, it's all going to be, the same way that you would troubleshoot like an APNS issue, your Jamf Software Server log would say something about issues with connectivity to Apple servers over 2195, 2196. If you didn't have that stuff open, I could see having issues as well, but I've never seen it, probably because at that point your APNS wouldn't work, and so you've got bigger problems.
Yeah, I guess I just point out to the Apple School Manager, the requests are just a REST service, so they're just gets and posts to HTTP clients.
So we can make class names unique in Apple School Manager. They seem to reset when they sync with the student information system.
I can tell you that bug will be fixed in the next release.
Boom. That indicates that there will be a next release?
Eventually, sometime.
With Apple School Manager still in pre-beta, do you have a recommended timeline for actually moving to it without expected issues? I believe that was someone from Apple in the audience.
No.
Negative.
I can speak to that.
Thank you, support Matt.
Yeah. So what I've been telling my customers is for those that have not yet gone to Apple School Manager, really if you're waiting for an SIS importer like PowerSchool to be integrated in there with it, wait for that to happen. I've seen issues, and my buddy Eric knows, if you use the SFTP uploads first and then you go through and use the SIS importer, we ran into an issue where there were duplicate users created in Apple School Manager. If there,
teachers, classes, everything.
and if there are duplicate users in Apple School Manager, your JSS is going to try to pull in duplicates as well. So if one of the things that you're waiting for is an SIS importer, I would recommend just starting there, wait for it. Yeah.
A follow-up to that, how would we know when our SIS Skyward in Wisconsin is going to be kind of on the map for that?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, how do we know the SIS importers that are going to be on the map? I don't know. I would have thought one of them, yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I talked to my Apple rep a lot too, and these guys told me about Infinite when Infinite Campus finally went in. But,
Sorry.
after they found my Apple rep, and then they started pounding their people. So.
All right, so officially, Jamf software is not saying, or Jamf is not saying to hound your Apple rep. I want to be clear about this. So, will I am not either. So a few months ago, sites got added into Apple School Manager. So the next question, will Apple School Manager in Jamf Pro be site specific? That's a Boolean, so nodding of heads, or I don't think that's in the API that we get information on yet, but.
So yeah, so if you've seen, there's no exact explicit functionality in Jamf yet around that. There is some functionality. You can cite your deb token and use Jamf's citable functionality. As far as the locations and sites from Apple School Manager, there is no direct correlation and integration yet. I would suggest if you have input or feedback on that, it would be great to have feature requests to know how you would expect that functionality to work.
My assumption would be someday over the rainbow, but don't hold your breath. So can we reset the matching, ideally selectively? So if we pull the data in, can we?
So I guess with this question, we mean if we started an import and then it didn't match all the way, if there's a way to go back? Is that the general question of that, whoever?
Pretty much, I mean, if you made a mistake with the match,
Yes.
change your criteria.
The thing that I've always suggested with the matching criteria, when you do that user import, one of those first screens that should pop up is the matching users. If you don't see that screen and it gives you the overview of how many ever new users you're creating, don't go through with it. You don't have to complete the import. So you can go back to the Apple School Manager tab in the Jamf Pro, and you can go back, fix the matching criteria, try again. That's honestly something that I've done. Managed Apple ID contains username in the JSS. It all comes back to making sure when we set up Apple School Manager that we get our naming convention right. So one of the things that's breezed over pretty quickly is creating your managed Apple ID. But what you want to do is for LDAP, if you're using any sort of directory service, if you've got your users named a certain way, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to get those managed Apple IDs the same naming criteria, because matching is going to be a lot easier, and it doesn't matter if you import LDAP users first into Jamf Pro, or if you import your Apple School Manager users and then end up enrolling with your LDAP users after. But it's something that, yeah, for matching, you don't have to complete the process. Just go back and try it again.
Obviously, you've been on a lot of these support calls. Pretty stoked you're up here. So another one from Chris. I'm not going to actually ask your question until you look down and to the right. Yeah, you don't really look like your Twitter avatar, but that's cool. Anyways, so has/can import interface be modified to clearly indicate that importing a class also imports the users? Looks like. Oh, so that's a feature request.
Yeah, that would.
All right.
It's something that is there, but I agree it's not clearly represented because it's essentially the same at the end of importing users. You get that overview screen. And yeah, if you miss the fact where it shows this many users coming in, because honestly you would think if you're importing classes, that's all you're bringing in, but you're correct.
And also, people who just go to the user interface and import their users, they don't know that the classes will also do it, which is actually a better method workflow.
Correct. And actually, I've seen better luck importing, I've seen better luck actually importing all your users first and then going through classes, because I've seen some instances where duplicate users have been made importing classes first.
This is an infinite campus question, but I'm going to guess that it's actually going to be true for most of the student information systems. So when connected to, insert student information system here, what is workflow/time before students appear in Jamf Pro?
So I can answer this from assumption that we're asking when I add something to my student information system, how long does it take to go to Apple and then come to Jamf? And so in our experience, the Apple service will be updated daily, and then if we go back and look at our sync system settings in the JSS will be updated at that point in time when the time of day when that was set to. So the best way to do that would be to set it to daily and tell it to do that every night at some point in time, such that it pulls all that data in overnight and gets all that out to the iPads before anyone uses them in the morning.
Cool. Thank you. You're so awesome. All right. Is the matching process creating LDAP users yet, or still just local JSS users? And I had to adjust because it seemed to fit with the question.
The matching is going off of the JSS users.
And if you want more than that, then that sounds like a feature request, although that's kind of a challenging one because then we're putting data into AD and we don't really.
Yeah, we don't.
With anything. Yeah. Can you delete users out of Jamf without removing them from all of the classes they are assigned to?
Not today.
No. No. Now go away, or I shall have to taunt you. No. Can you use a JDS as the distribution point to host images?
Not presently. The hang up there would be the certificates. There has been some discussion of how we can expand this and iterate on that feature. So again, I guess if there are specifics that can be put on a Jamf Nation feature request, that would be one useful route. But currently, the JDS would not be able to accomplish that because of the certificate situation. Another question, we know there was some concern about kind of having to do this other server. So if there's information on, I guess, how you're importing those users, maybe there is a sleeker feature that we can build on top of that. So again, I would ask for some specifics on your workflow on Jamf Nation. Cool.
Thank you. The next one is a comment. We like those because we don't have to answer them. It is cool use of the API to link objects. So whoever thought of that? Yep. You're welcome, even though I didn't say it. All right, so next, please detail what you can do in the database when you match the Apple School Manager to the JSS user object and clarify how connected they are. A lot of matching questions.
So I guess, let's see. So I'll start by trying to clarify what is happening when we match the users. So again, we go back, we set up our matching criteria, and when we import those, what is happening inside the JSS when it determines there's a match is, if we think about the user page in the JSS again, we have a general section and we have this new roster section where the education data goes. And the education data is just a subtable with the foreign key back to the user, and they're linked that way. And from that point on, they're always linked, even if the matching data changes. I hope that helps answer the question.
If it doesn't, I would say feel free to repost and refine. This is a fun question. How's the Infinite Campus connector working? I guess that's just an overall, like, are you digging it? Does it suck? Oh, so someone in the audience said the Infinite Campus connector is not working right now?
I talked to Apple Enterprise Support earlier this week because we tried to set it up, and according to them, it is a known product issue, and it does not work.
So for those who,
Yeah, according to Apple, it's a known product issue. What we're seeing with here is, it was actually when in Apple School Manager tweet that campus actually putting in the keys and everything else, it would time out. And so nothing gets imported at all.
I've seen some that have worked.
Yeah, mine, I've been able to link. I had problems with the key, but I was just fine fingering it.
Sure.
So the first couple of times when we tried it, it didn't want to sync. But then once I was able to get that key right, then it,
so if I could summarize the conversation for those that will be watching this later, I guess it depends. You know. But we're going to move on to the next question, if that's okay with you guys. So is there a way to see what classes a teacher is a member of? If not, could I use the API to do that?
I don't believe there's any separate listing of that today. But yes, that can all be taken from the API. All the classroom objects and all the new fields added both for education and to the users in general are all available in the API. So we could look at each classroom and the teachers on each of them and would have to compile a list.
So I would say when you're doing a get, like if you were to get on classes by ID, if you put in brackets a range, so like it would be JSS resource / classes / ID / left bracket, and then your range right bracket. That'll pull all of them, and then if you just piped that through XPath to get the specific node to the teacher, you're basically just going to get a data dump that's going to be teacher names in every single class, and that would be probably the fastest. And then at that point, it's going to tell you what class ID that was in as well. So it would be a pretty simple process to just look at that list and see the teacher name and then go from there.
I love it when I can actually tell based on someone's Twitter avatar who it is in the room, by the way. So the last question before we go on break is, can we get a quick overview of what is in the marvelous part 2 of this session?
Yeah, so we've got some talk on the education profile itself, a little bit of looking at what we're actually sending. We're going to hit on the other settings that you can set on the classroom for kind of customizing the home screen for students. Am I missing something? You want to add on to that? Okay, so yeah, a lot of depth on the profile, and then the specifics of what we're giving to the student and teacher devices.
Awesome. Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and go on break. Thank you all so much for coming and staying through this, and we hope to see you in a little bit.